do you fare, my loyal 9 patriots? I'm going to propose to you 2 questions to everyone that has children, family, and friends in the public school system. Do you really know who is educating your children? And do you know who is making the policies for those educators? Because in this video, I'm going to share with you the globalist agenda that is taking place in your children's schools. This agenda goes beyond critical race theory and the Homo-Fascism agenda that is taking place. These are simply the transmission belts. And lastly, I'm going to share with you multiple ways we can counter this communist insider threat. So let's get started. At this point, most of us know COVID is the greatest weapon ever invented. By pure death count alone, the atom bomb explosions in Nagasaki and Hiroshima killed approximately 105,000 people, while COVID claims to have killed approximately 4 million people. Shouldn't all those death counts be pinned on China? Shouldn't China be responsible for crashed markets, mass transfers of wealth to the rich, theft of an election, and the degradation of our education systems? Because if you are paying attention, you understand this is a global attack on the West and a way to bring America under the rule of communism by our own hand. Some of their methods are to weaponize the public school systems via teachers' unions, school boards, leftist teachers, and radical academic movements such as critical race theory, with the end goal to corrupt the minds of the youth and turn them against God and their family. Let's start this off with examining the American Federation of Teachers, AFT for short, and their president, Randi Weingarten. AFT is the group that is demanding schools be virtual because of COVID. They also endorse critical race theory, and they are the same group that is now demanding that vaccines be mandatory. More on that later. But if you have a teacher that is part of this communist organization, it's time for you and other parents to demand that they be fired. And I think that after I finish presenting the facts to you about the AFT and their president, you will require that they be fired. Unfortunately, because this video isn't solely about the AFT, I'm going to have to get right to the issue. The AFT president, Randi Weingarten, is a Jewish lesbian that is married to another female named Sharon Kleinbaum, who is also a rabbi. Both of these communists are in line for a position in the Biden regime. Weingarten is in line to be Secretary of Education, and Kleinbaum is poised to be the Commission of International Religious Freedom. Additionally, Weingarten has ties to John Podesta, Hillary Clinton, and was a possible candidate for Hillary Clinton's Senate seat. Because Weingarten is a radical communist, she does not believe in responsibility and accountability. When asked if teachers should be held accountable for failing students, she replied, quote, "Would you want your oncologist or your mom or dad's oncologist to be graded on the survival rates of his or her patients?" End quote. Because she is a pseudo-intellectual, she does not understand that doctors are in fact held accountable for performance. If you remember from my previous video, I discussed the Council on Foreign Relations and how they control the Uniparty and are essentially the shadow government advancing the communist agenda. I wanted to provide you a baseline knowledge because while Randi Weingarten is not a member of the CFR, she does, however, have ties to it and speaks at events where she praises Chairman Biden and insults Republicans. While Weingarten may not have been appointed to any government positions yet, like many other CFR members and communist unions, they influence those in government behind the scenes. For example, the communist Arne Duncan, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, the genius that advocated for Common Core standards, was influenced by Weingarten many times, including when Weingarten advocated for a program known as, quote, "last in, first out," end quote. When in reference to teachers, Weingarten and Duncan were implementing policies where if you are a brand new teacher to a public school, then budget cuts occur. The newest teacher will be fired. At face value, this sounds reasonable. However, the problem is that this doesn't consider teachers that are failing their students. What if the new teacher takes her class that was trending at a 2.6 GPA and then gets them over 3.0? Should she still be fired? According to Weingarten, yes. Because Weingarten doesn't believe in holding teachers accountable for their failing students, because she is a pro-communist, political activist, and hides behind her multi-billion-dollar union for protection and the furtherance of turning America into a communist country. And if we just examine the AFT's funding, it's absolutely astonishing. They are, of course, a tax-exempt organization that is under the 501c3 umbrella, much like other communist organizations we have talked about, like the CFR, the Chinese Progressive Association, which we covered in my BLM video. And if you want to see proof that BLM is a Chinese communist-owned organization, go check that out. But if we just take a look at the publicly available tax records for the AFT, we see they have millions of dollars at their disposal. And just looking at the names for each line of funding, it's kind of questionable, such as Militancy Defense Fund, Solidarity Funds, and even Building Funds. Even the amount they hold in common stocks and mutual funds should have every member questioning where their money is going. Weingarten herself makes over $560,000 per year, 9 times the average salary of a teacher. Weingarten is now advocating for mandated vaccines for all teachers, even though she has no medical education and is completely unqualified. I would wager to say it's because she hangs out with the Whoopi Goldberg-approved Dr. Jill Biden and will potentially be the next Secretary of Education. Or that on the AFT's website, they even have a tab specifically congratulating the Biden-Harris junta. Their mission statement says it all. Reading the last sentence, it says, and I quote, "We are committed to advancing these principles through community engagement, organizing, collective bargaining, and political activism, and especially through the work our members do." And to top everything off, the AFT donated $18.4 million to the Democrats from 2019 to 2020. Let's start this segment off with one of the goals of communism. Quote, "Get control of schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda, soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' associations, put party line in textbooks." I want you to be thinking of this as we discuss this section. So let's examine the school boards across this country. Now more than ever, we are seeing parents all across America standing up to their communist school boards. We have seen viral video after viral video of mothers and fathers vehemently voicing their concerns about the actions of their totalitarian school boards that are clearly motivated by political agendas rather than the education of students. We've even seen educators in tears quit in front of their school boards. This is where we see COVID step into the spotlight, and understand this: COVID is not the threat. It is the reaction by humans that is the real threat. COVID is the laser pointer on the wall, so the communist traitors on the left can covertly implement critical race theory, the sexualization of kids via the LGBTQ movement, all in the name of diversity, equity, and COVID safety. School boards are even making pathetic excuses on why they are forcing students to wear masks, with the main excuse being that they are following federal CDC guidelines on COVID policies. And yet the state governments they work under have no problem defying federal law on drugs such as marijuana. There is some good news though. Some public schools have successfully eradicated critical race theory from the classroom setting. But the battle is not over. In fact, it's only getting more intense. Because if you have taken anything from my videos, the communists will adapt and their critical race theory agenda will take a new name, such as, quote, professional development, diversity training, culturally responsive teaching and learning, or affinity groups. Affinity groups, or more accurately described as racial segregation, are dishonestly described as, quote, places where learning occurs and where groups of people are drawn together because of shared strong interests, characteristics, or engagement in a common activity. Let me translate this for you. Everyone but white people are to attend these groups. This is because white people get their own group called, quote, white affinity spaces, where white people get to come together to learn about racism, anti-racism, racial equity, and social justice. And of course, this is partially attributed to Black Lives Matter, the communist group that hates America. In these white affinity spaces, white people get to, quote, discover the consequences of their white racial identity with the context of white supremacist culture and history. This is part of a dehumanization campaign by the communist left, because they know people of all colors will resist this rhetoric, and when you do resist, you get branded as the Nazi racist white supremacist. Because the communist left believes that white people alone, and white men in particular, bear the entire responsibility for thousands of years of genocide, slavery, and colonialism all around the world, or simply known as blood guilt, which is a North Korean tactic used to intimidate North Koreans from escaping communism. For example, if a North Korean escapes, The family that remained in North Korea are arrested, beaten, and sometimes executed, and the family members are then placed into concentration camps. Don't be surprised when the Mockingbird media begins a national push for Trump supporters, white people, and unvaccinated Americans to be placed into concentration camps, because it's already started. This is why we must rid critical race theory, affinity spaces, or whatever form it takes out of our school systems. While Senator Tom Cotton did sponsor a bill that prohibits federal funds from going to pre-K and K through 12 schools that teach critical race theory, this is barely a win. Mainly because schools do not have to accept federal funding, and if teaching critical race theory is their goal, the communist left has no regard for the law and will do it anyways. Senator Cotton merely provided a band-aid to a wound that requires bright lights and cold steel. Listen to me carefully. The Soviets live and breathe deception. You cannot understand what they are doing without understanding this. Indeed, you can't even begin to understand communism without understanding deception, which is very rarely mentioned in textbooks on communism. But let's rack the clock back here for a second and talk about Common Core that was implemented back in 2010. When Obama was implementing his Common Core scheme to destroy the growths of children's educational development, there was an uproar across the country, and yet it still went through. Because you cannot reason with a communist. They hate this country and will pretend to listen to your complaints, but in the end, they will implement whatever radical policy they want, regardless of the law. Your local school district can prevent Common Core from infiltrating their system, and many states are now attempting to escape it. But look how long it's taking to gain ground and affect change. Do you really want to battle this radical communist agenda for 11 plus years? We've identified the problem. Now it's time to execute on a solution, because the radical left isn't stopping. In fact, they're actually increasing their efforts to push this country to its breaking point. For example, if you live in Oregon, Governor Kate Brown signed a bill that would allow students who can't read, write, or do math to still be able to graduate high school. Her communist regime claims that it will benefit, quote, Oregon's Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, tribal, and students of color. In essence, she is saying that because of their skin color, they lack the intelligence to perform high school level mathematics, reading, and writing. Moreover, she is saying that her educators lack the ability to educate these minority groups, when in reality, her poor leadership and ability to adapt and overcome obstacles has destroyed generations of Oregon's youth educational development via her fascist lockdowns and virtual learning policies. Her solution? Lower the standard and continue to create citizens that will be reliant on the government. Because when you are reliant on the government, you are easier to control. Or better said, quote, those seeking ultimate control over American lives must first create a detached and illiterate citizenry that is malleable to a false narrative and forgetfulness. Some of this can be traced back to the pointless creation of the Department of Education in 1980, whose budget is $68 billion. We can see SAT and ACT scores have almost continually decreased since their inception. But if public schools aren't teaching students how to read, write, and do math, what are they teaching? Again, let me expose you to more of the goals of communism. Quote, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Kevin Jennings is an LGBTQ activist, executive director of Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, GLSEN, which is under the banner of Safe School Program. Again, the issue is never the issue. He was appointed to lead this effort devoted to normalizing the same-sex attractions in the minds of children at the Department of Education by President Obama. While he was a teacher, he failed to report to authorities that a 15-year-old student told him of sexual relationship with an older man. Instead, Jennings apparently encouraged the boy to use a condom. Jennings praised Harry Hay of North American Association for Man-Boy Love Association. Again, time and time again, we see the left responsible for pedophilia. His network is funded by the CDC and partners with numerous corporate companies such as Hollister, Disney, Target, Wells Fargo, and even YouTube. The network program is designed to encourage kids to question their gender identity and sexual orientation. And that is not even a particle of frozen water on this dystopian iceberg. 1/5 of Americans live in states that require public schools to teach LGBTQ ideology. all the way down to kindergarten. This destructive ideology is rooted in almost every form of curricula, so even escaping it is practically futile. But this didn't appear out of thin air. Many of these radical agendas stem from William Reich. If you have followed my channel, Reich was mentioned in my Frankfurt School videos, and he was the guy who masturbated to his mother, men, and committed acts of bestiality. This quote sums up the main reasons for their sexualization of kids, and it comes from Reich. Sex ed. It would divest parents from their moral authority. This is why we see UN globalists continually overstepping their boundaries. For example, UN LGBT czar, homosexual activist Petit Mutar Buhorn, when discussing homosexual activities in school systems, he said authorities must advance in education activities in secondary schools, initiatives that integrate sexual diversity inside the school system. He is trying to target the indoctrination of youth as early as possible by stating, the younger the better. This is a clear plan, not for LGBT acceptance, but for Gleichschaltung policy enforcement, which stems from when the Nazis were rising to power. Gleichschaltung was their way to enforce a political conformity in all sectors of society, because their end goal is not LGBT acceptance, but to whittle down the parental authority and eventually make bestiality and pedophilia legal, which in some states they've already started. So let us understand the situation. We are at war with a tough and determined enemy. School districts must stop fixating on federal funding and accreditation. Schools need to return to where quality of education is what truly matters, rather than the number of students that graduate. I understand some schools need federal funding. However, many schools do not need federal funding, and the option to refuse the carrot the federal government is dangling rests on the shoulders of the schools and districts. Once you accept that money, you are now beholden to the lender. Parents need to run for school board and usher in a wave of red-blooded patriotic Americans at every level of infrastructure, including becoming a teacher. Lastly, homeschooling doesn't have to be for the weird kids on the block. Because of the failure of school boards, teachers, and the communist COVID policies plaguing our public schools, there is a rise in homeschooling. Dennis Prager has stated many times that he speaks to parents that didn't homeschool, and by the time the kids graduate high school and progress to higher education, what started out as a conservative, patriotic student was transformed into an American-hating pro-communist radical. Do you really want that life for your kids? Loyal 9 out.